How do we as parents have those rare moments of revelation and epiphany? How do we shift our role from teacher to learner? How do we change the dynamic from adversarial to empathetic? Allowing us the space to listen, a kind of listening that does not assume we already know what our child is about to say, that does not offer up a scripted response. In that moment of listening, empathy, restraint, and stepping back, we begin to take on the role of learner, and we begin to come to terms with the lessons our children are teaching us about themselves.
I'm so pleased to welcome you to this evening's program with Sara Lawrence-Lightfoot, discussing her latest book, Growing Each Other Up, When Our Children Become Our Teachers. Sara Lawrence-Lightfoot is the Emily Hargroves Fisher Professor of Education at Harvard University and renowned author of 10 previous titles, including Exit, The Third Chapter, I've Known Rivers, Respect, and Balm in Gilead.
I will never forget a moment during a lunch I had with my old friend and colleague, Mary Catherine Bateson, a wise and straight-talking woman, an anthropologist whose blend of empiricism and wisdom has always made me see things differently. I had an agenda when I invited her to have a hot soup with me on a winter day in Cambridge several years ago. My daughter Talani, who had jumped into a precocious and volatile adolescence at 11, was then 15, and I was feeling weak and exhausted by the 4 years of accumulated conflicts at home. Asking Talani to clean up the dishes after dinner, a chore that was copiously and colorfully spelled out on a family job chart for the week, might elicit an escalation of anger, beginning with excuses that she had no time because of piles of homework awaiting her, moving on to declarations that I was being unfair and unreasonable, ending in raging accusations that her younger brother Martin had always been my favorite child. Her exit from the kitchen, dishes undone, punctuated by outrageous yelling and door slamming. Some battles were protracted, like the long-running struggle over her first tattoo. You had to have parental permission if you were under 18, and my 14-year-old daughter wanted to have a dolphin carved on her left upper arm, a chronic debate that would simmer for weeks of solicitous, then urgent pleading, and suddenly erupt into a full-blown press of accusations, claiming that I was infantilizing her, theatrically quoting passages from My Body, Myself. For the most part, her outrageous behavior was targeted at me and limited to the home front. Out in the world, she carried herself with poise and patience, maturity, and aplomb. As I lunched with my friend, I was feeling particularly despondent about the years stretching out in front of us that were sure to bring more treachery, a treachery made all the more penetrating because of the tender and lover longing. I thought that Bateson, the cultural anthropologist, might help me. Actually, I was looking to be rescued, to see something productive, maybe even redemptive, in our mother-daughter struggles. And I thought that as a mother of a daughter a dozen years older than mine, she might have some survival skills up her sleeve. While my soup got cold in front of me, I spun out my war stories, and then I waited for her sympathy and support. Bateson listened attentively, never interrupting the rush of emotion that I could not seem to contain or temper. Then she said something surprising. Your daughter is living on another planet, and she has a lot to teach you about it. Listen to her. Her spare, didactic comment at first felt facile and unsympathetic. She did not elaborate, did not respond to my hunger for her advice. For weeks, I brooded about her take on my troubles and finally realized that she was saying something powerful and fundamental, that these intergenerational conversations, even the hardest ones, are opportunities for parental growth and insight, that our children are our teachers, particularly because they are living in a world so different from the one in which we grew up. They are becoming people different from any that we have known before. Now, from a safe distance of almost 2 decades, As I reflect on these love wars with my daughter, their fury and their drama, I wondered how those moments propelled me as a learner. I wondered how I was occasionally able to get some distance on the volatile encounters, how I was able to find enough restraint to resist the tit-for-tat that would typically escalate into pitched battle. How do we as parents have those rare moments of revelation and epiphany? How do we shift our role from teacher to learner? How do we change the dynamic from adversarial to empathetic? Allowing us the space to listen, a kind of listening that does not assume we already know what our child is about to say, that does not offer up a scripted response. In that moment of listening, empathy, restraint, and stepping back, we begin to take on the role of learner, and we begin to come to terms with the lessons our children are teaching us about themselves and their emerging identity, and about the world they are inhabiting, the planet which is their perch. But our learning is not always provoked through opposition and embattlement with our children. Sometimes the teaching comes in sweet and tender moments, during interludes of insight and intimacy. Even during the tug-of-war years with my daughter, Talani, she was a generous and empathetic teacher. Her identity as an artist firmly established by the time she was 3. Over the years, Talani has drawn, painted, and sculpted me, creating portraits that have given me insight into how she sees me and who I am becoming. On my 50th birthday, she did a large watercolor of me. She called it The Essence of Mama. I was stripped of all of my jewelry and combs. A filmy apricot scarf draped around my bare shoulders, my hair pulled back in a bun, was black on one side and silver on the other. I gazed at the image that did not look like me, but seemed to capture my essence and my future. I could see me, the me I was becoming, anticipating a nakedness and a vulnerability that I was still covering up, an unadorned strength that awaited me. In fact, I love my daughter's revelatory view of her mother so much for its truth value, for its compassion, that I decided to have it placed on the back flap of my book jacket instead of the typical author's photo. I gaze at the painting and I feel known. Growing Each Other Up examines the developmental changes in parents that grow out of growing our children, the things our children teach us as we raise them. My book is a counterpoint and challenge to the prevailing views of intergenerational learning. Most of the developmental literature has, of course, focused on the trajectories of child growth, charting the cognitive, emotional, and social learning that takes place during infancy, early childhood, puberty, and adolescence, revealing the non-linear path of progression and regression that marks each developmental hurdle, exploring the ways in which parents and caregivers can support and nurture developmental milestones along the way. And this literature has primarily seen the parents as teachers and shapers, guiders and supporters who are supporting their children's learning, reinforcing the skills, rituals, and values that they believe are important to the child's survival and success in the world. The learning is seen as flowing in one direction, the knowledge passing from parent to child. But all of us know that this is a skewed view, one that in its preoccupation with early development and in its view of parents as the consummate teachers and cultural reinforcers, misses the two-sidedness and adaptive dynamic of socialization between parents and their children. It is a static view that is blind to the ways in which parenting requires lifelong learning, a pedagogy that is often composed by our children. In Growing Each Other Up, however, my interest was in exploring the ways in which children become their parents' teachers and the way this intergenerational socialization is expressed when adolescence transitions into young adulthood. When the developmental expectations are shifting, adulthood looms on the horizon, and the dynamics of authority are being reshaped. I wanted to have deep and probing conversations with mothers and fathers who have children between the ages of 15 and 35, those progeny of early maturity who are still figuring out the calculus between distance and intimacy, balancing separation and closeness with their parents, those offspring who may even be parents themselves. Whether these almost grown offspring are living with their parents or not, the relational and emotional bonds continue to be negotiated. The intensity and complexity changes, but it does not abate. I chose these, what I call liminal years of emerging adult symmetry, because I expected that the dynamics of learning for the parents would be more complex and subtle, surprising and revelatory, and because this 20-year stretch of intergenerational learning has been largely unexplored in the literature. Growing each other up, then, is an examination of the dynamics and layers of parental learning. The lens of learning I use is broad, including lessons that are mind-altering, heart-expanding, and morally complex, including the learning of new skills and competencies, the development of insights, the testing of values, and the shifts in ideology and perspective-taking on fundamental questions of race, culture, gender, and identity, and including lessons on love, work, and play. The voices of the parent protagonists tell their poignant and powerful stories, stories that mine the particular and reveal the universal. So for 2 years, I traveled around the country interviewing parents, most of them in their middle years and most of them mothers, about their experiences learning from their children, about the moments when the tables turned, the relationship flipped, and their offspring became their mentors and guides, about the learning that felt like long-running plays, longitudinal stories with a narrative arc, and the lessons that seemed to appear all of a sudden, like an epiphany. The interviews were probing and intense, filled with revelatory moments, expressions of regret and guilt, and proud exclamations of admiration, respect, and love. People wept and laughed and surprised themselves with digging up memories long forgotten or discovering new twists on an old practiced narrative. Our conversations moved back and forth through time, recording the past and reporting on the present, skipping years and generations, searching for origins and roots, and using those to explain the present and imagine the future. The 15 narratives I chose to include in this volume echo and resonate with the voices of the more than 36 folks I interviewed. And they reflect 4 overarching themes of witness, growing, intimacy, and acceptance that emerged as central to the pedagogy composed by almost grown children and that shaped the development of the book's chapters. First, when children teach their parents to take on the role of witness, they are asking them to listen and observe, not intervene and fix. They are urging their parents to be still, present, and attentive, to notice the subtle changes in them, to resist the impulse to act and protect, to learn to do nothing. Second, it is not only that parents learn through witnessing, really seeing and hearing their children, they also tell stories about the ways in which their offspring become the inspiration for their own growing, the ways in which they instigate developmental changes in their parents through challenge, questioning, and struggle, through leading and modeling, through refusal and resistance, through provocations that are at once inspiring and unsettling. Parenthood itself becomes a mechanism for growth. Third, part of the experience of growing through parenting is palpably expressed in the contours and depth of intimacy. that changes as children develop, as they move towards independence, and as they become their own persons. These lessons on intimacy that parents learn from their offspring underscore the very changing dynamic and process of calculating closeness and distance, connection and restraint between them, and the paradoxical, surprising revelation that it is often the growing distance that creates the space for deeper intimacy to develop. The fourth and final relational theme that emerges in the parents' learning narratives resonates with the hard-won, difficult lessons of acceptance, the ways in which almost grown offspring, particularly those who are different from their parents in large and visible ways, insist that their parents see them as whole and worthy, not damaged or compromised. The way they teach them to disentangle their notions of deviance and difference, illness and identity, and accept them for who they are. Witness, growing, intimacy, acceptance. It is interesting to note that these overarching meta lessons are not skill-based or didactically delivered. Rather, they are anchored in changing relationships and developing identities. And it is important to recognize that these meta lessons instigated by our children are not clearly circumscribed or discrete. They merge and they blend in the stories parents tell. A tale about wise and quiet witnessing becomes an opportunity for surprising growth and hard-won acceptance. It is also true that these meta lessons are most vividly expressed through subtlety and detail, the history and biography of individual stories. So let me give you a glimpse into two stories that begin to capture the power and poignancy of the lessons we learned from our almost grown children. The first on negotiating intimacy, the second on finding acceptance. Both stories capture the love and suffering that anchor and motivate parental learning. So this is just a glimpse. On intimacy, calculating closeness and distance, balancing connection and restraint. Eva Galanis, a first-generation immigrant from Greece, works hard to protect her twin daughters, Athena and Isadora, from what she regards as the distractions, threats, and dangers of their American lives. She wants to shield them from the vacuous materialism, the superficiality and consumerism of fast foods and shopping malls, television, and sleepovers. She wants to guard their bodies and minds from the cultural trivia and garbage, her words, that might seep in. By the time the girls reach adolescence, they are chafing at her anxious overprotectiveness. They are resisting her efforts to control them. Eva recognizes in their resistance feelings that she once had as a girl when her own parents wanted to control her life by shutting out the world around them. But the generational echoes of her resenting her own parents' dominance and inhibitions don't seem to be strong enough to change her pattern of rigidity and control with her twins. Her daughters, taking turns and acting strategically, push back against their mother to create a bigger space for themselves. And as they do, they expand the horizons of Eva's mothering and make room for real intimacy. There is one story that Eva lingers on longer than any others, a story so ordinary in its contours and yet so memorable in revealing how she has learned so much through the teachings of her children in what she calls the bicultural spaces in her life. She remembers one weekend when the girls were 16, during a stretch of several weeks when she had been very consumed by work and when Dimitris, her husband, had been off traveling, when she decided that the three of them would have a special Sunday together. A few days before the special day, Eva began to concoct a plan that included many of the things she loved doing with her daughters. They would go to a museum. They have lunch at a wonderful place by the water. Maybe look for dresses at one of their favorite funky shops in town. Afterwards, they would return home and cook a delicious dinner together. She had even found a new crafts museum that had a handbag exhibit that she knew the girls would enjoy. Even as Eva tells about imagining and anticipating the special day in her mind, she recognizes, of course, this was my ideal day, not theirs. When Sunday morning rolled around, the girls immediately asked whether they could drop by the mall first before proceeding on with the rest of the day. I don't want to take them to the mall, says Eva, switching to the present tense with an intensity that she still feels years later. I feel hurt by their request. I feel angry and inadequate as their mother. She lingers on the word inadequate, and I ask her why that is the primary feeling she had. I ask myself, how come I have not been able to give them the strength to overcome this peer pressure to go to the mall? What could I have done to be a better mother who would support them in making a better and healthier choice? Even with all of those strong feelings rumbling underneath, Eva delivered them to the mall and pretended that she was fine with it. She knew in her heart that the mall was their town square, a place to gather and hang out with their friends. They rarely shopped there. They only went there to see and be seen, to meet and greet, to waste time. When Eva went to pick them up several hours later, she was acutely feeling the pain, as she put it, of having been deprived of her special day with her daughters. After delivering their friends back to their homes, the three of them drove along in silence, the girls aware of their mother's disappointment and barely masked rage. Athena, who was sitting in the front next to Eva, turned on the radio, and the loud hip-hop beats cut through the silence. More evidence of the ways in which the girls were getting completely swept up in American materialism and superficiality. I tell her, turn the radio off. Now I'm screaming at the top of my lungs. I've completely lost it. I tell them, okay, from now on you can watch TV every day and go to the mall every weekend and eat junk food every day if you like. Her screaming out of control suddenly makes her feel, as she puts it, like a child in this encounter. Especially when Athena shoots back with a more mature question. Well then, why did you say that it was fine that we go to the mall? If you felt that strongly, you should have told us. Eva is aware of her daughter, quote, holding her ground and sounding more grown up. Then she herself feels, as she responds, you must have known that I was upset and it was up to you to apologize. During this heated exchange between Athena and Eva, Isadora says nothing. When they arrive home, everyone silently retreats to the bedrooms. Doors slam as Eva tries to get in the last word of high-pitched screaming. I give up, she howls. Do whatever you want to do with your lives. She feels depleted and done. The next morning, Eva finds a message from Isadora on the desk. She has put out Chicken Soup for the Teenage Soul, a book that they have over the years read together, and she has drawn an arrow and written, read this. The book tells the story of a foster child who moves from family to family because at each home she provokes trouble, and they decide she cannot live with them anymore. They throw her out. It is a story of multiple abandonments of parents who refuse to go the distance. Finally, the girl gets to a foster home where the mother responds to her troublemaking by asking her what she can do to help her, how she might make it better for her. She didn't give up, is the book's punchline. This was a teachable moment, says Eva, recalling how desperate she felt and how the girls each took the high road, the more mature stance. I was feeling immature in their shadows, she says poignantly. In retrospect, even in this retelling, Eva recognizes that her out-of-control rage was an expression of her feelings of inadequacy. I was in struggle, trying my best to keep the girls close to me, wanting to make them strong so that they would not be swept away by the commercial cover of American culture. At the same time, I was working to understand how much they wanted to belong, and being reminded that as a girl, I also wanted to belong when my parents kept me from being engaged in the world around me. I also knew in my heart that I wanted the girls to be able to straddle both worlds. I wanted them to be adult in making wise choices, but there was also a big part of me that wanted them to make my choices. Her face seems to show the lines from all of the strained layers of conflict and struggle she has felt as a mother, all the reverberations that linger from her own childhood of straddling cultures, all the echoes from her sustained attempt to protect her girls from the bad influences that surround them, all the ways in which she knows that they need to feel as if they belong to their world. A long silence surrounds us as Eva seems exhausted by offering up these competing interpretations, as she searches for the origins of her pain and rage on that special Sunday when the plans went awry. Finally, she sums up her hard-won learning. If things change, then I have to change. I must learn to be flexible and resourceful, not dogged and resistant. I'm learning how to adapt in order to meet my kids where they are and in order to engage the world around them. And the second glimpse is on acceptance, interpreting the fusions and confusions between difference and deviance. Naomi Sawyer understands the parents of the special needs students she teaches in a way that no one else can, no one else except a parent of a child with a disability. Mothering Jonah, her autistic son, she is able to hear both sides of the conversation, identifying with the parents' fears and frustrations, their disappointments and their denial, and empathizing with their long journey towards respect and acceptance as they learn to see and honor the strengths in their children. It is, of course, somewhat easier to be a professional on the other side of the desk, patiently and strategically dispensing wisdom and guidance, than it is to be a mother living through the despair and disequilibrium, the suffering and the loving, and working to recognize and appreciate Jonah's extraordinary gifts. He is an amazing, gifted, and exuberant artist, as well as his unusual traits that often appear opaque and mysterious, difficult to decode, understand, and accept. Naomi Sawyer remembers an old photograph of her son, Jonah, reading at 13 months, sitting in a basket of books. Weeks earlier, his parents had discovered that he could read the word stop on the television screen when he watched Sesame Street, and the name of Mickey Mouse on the cover of one of his favorite books. He was, Naomi explains to me, hypolexic. But even though he was an extremely precocious reader, he was not able to use language to communicate. When he uttered words in short staccato spurts, he always seemed to be talking into the air, never looking at or relating to the people around him. Jonah was very verbal, says Naomi, but he used idiosyncratic language. Although Jonah has made great strides in communicating with words, he still, at 26, struggles with understanding social signals, especially with facing discord or conflict. Struggles that often find their expression in a jumble of perseverating words. He hates it when people get angry with one another, or when someone is made to feel disappointed or diminished. He perseverates over even the smallest slight or gesture that is hurtful, and it fills his mind with what he calls very negative feelings that are hard to let go of. His antennae are always raised in response to injustice, Naomi offers an example of Jonah's despair at an event that should have brought him pride and joy. A couple of months ago, he won the first prize in a walking race at the Special Olympics. But instead of glowing or even gloating over his victory, he immediately expressed his sadness for those who did not win the race. Jonah hates competition and avoids winning, says Naomi. He doesn't want to see a loser. He is the most unselfish person I know, and he has taught me a great deal about humility. Naomi often faced tough choices in trying to guide her son through the thicket of emotions he was feeling and she was witnessing. How could she help him learn to protect himself? How could she lessen his anguish and help him understand that some things could not be solved by gestures of patience and goodwill? How could she teach him those things without destroying his deep and loving instincts? More than once, Naomi tells me that Jonah is extraordinary in the way he loves everyone unconditionally. Her eyes overflow with tears as she describes his most tender qualities. He sees the essence of people. He never judges. It is deep in his spirit, this capacity to love. In this way, despite the vulnerability and unease it may cause him, and the negative feelings that get awakened, Naomi sees her son as what she calls a more evolved human being than most of the rest of us. It is from Jonah that she learns lessons of love all the time, and from him that she learns that sometimes love comes at great risk and cost. It has been a long journey getting to this place of acceptance, of feeling comfortable and proud of who her son is and who he is becoming. For so much of Jonah's early life, Naomi struggled with feelings of sadness, fear, and disappointment, focused on those things that what Jonah could not do, preoccupied with his challenges, his deficits, and difficulties, admiring his extraordinary artwork and focusing on his gifts and specialness sometimes brings up the opposite feelings, those moments when she longed for him to be normal, like everybody else. Naomi can still recall in detail the triggers that would make her feel angry and sad. 20 years later, Jonah's kindergarten class picture still sends a dagger through her. Jonah could not stand still and look straight at the camera like his peers, so his teacher gave him a book to look at, she says. When I opened the class picture, it was like a knife in my heart. There he was standing out like a sore thumb. Naomi remembers how she wanted to yell and scream and throw the photo across the room, so fierce was her rage. She wanted to shout at the teachers who were probably doing the best they could under the circumstances. Instead, she recalls with sadness that still feels fresh. I masked my very strong feelings. I was not proud of the way I felt. Looking back, she knows that she was still in denial, that the rage erupted out of her refusal to accept who Jonah was. And she also knows that acceptance is hard won. Denial dies hard. Naomi's life experiences with Jonah have been the best teacher in helping her work with and support other parents of special needs children. I see parents and I get it, she says. She gets that parents suffer mightily from the triggers when a part of them is still in denial, and that the severity of the disability is not the measure of their anger or their sadness. Even if they have a child, she says, who has a very mild form of dyslexia, it is as real to them as if their child had nonverbal autism. There is no metric to measure their pain. It hurts just as much. As she navigates the treacherous territories of truth-telling with parents, Naomi feels the raw and strong emotions that are always just below the surface in her. The pain of not seeing your child included, the difficulty in trusting the people who work with your children, and the anguish in seeing how your child measures up to other children. Slowly over the years, Naomi has learned how to let go of the dream, as she puts it, give up some of her need to control everything, and she has learned to care much less about how other people see Jonah. She reflects, I have had to take a hard look at myself, and it is still an ongoing process. But Jonah has led the way. He has been my teacher. She continues, her voice almost a whisper. I wanted to fix Jonah, and then I realized that I couldn't fix him. And that let me see his gifts and his contributions to the world. But even as she occasionally mourns the lost opportunities and laments the ways in which she might have moved more quickly in abandoning her need to control things, Naomi weighs the extraordinary benefit of being Jonah's mother. In some ways, she admits, he has made her an endlessly curious, as she puts it, lifelong learner. In trying to see the world from Jonah's perspective, she has had to expand the frames and lenses through which she regards her reality. He has opened my mind to every angle, she says proudly, and finally. In the reflection that opened my talk this evening, I am sitting with my friend and colleague, Mary Catherine Bateson, hoping to receive some parenting guidance and solace, trusting that she will have something useful to tell me about how to navigate my way through the adolescent struggles I am daily waging with my daughter, Tulani. Bateson's response, your daughter is living on another planet and she has a lot to teach you, at first sounds unsympathetic and facile. With time, I get over my disappointment and defensiveness and discover the wisdom in her words. Now, after listening to dozens of stories by parents that parents have told me about the focus and form of their children's pedagogy, I am even more convinced of the ways in which our progeny introduce us to the planet they inhabit, one that is different from the one we are living on. We can be informed and enlarged by their teachings if we are prepared to listen. Bateson might also have been warning me that a deepening love, a growing intimacy and respect between my daughter and me would not come without suffering. That the lessons our children teach us are often provoked by the pain and disequilibrium they experience, endure, and cause. In his magnificent book, Far from the Tree, Andrew Solomon makes an important distinction in talking about the complex and hard-won love relationships suffused with suffering that parents develop with their children who are profoundly different from them. Suffering does not necessarily imply love, Solomon says, but love implies suffering. And what changes with these children and their extraordinary situations is the shape of the suffering, and in consequence, the shape of the love forced into a more difficult form, end quote. In Growing Each Other Up, we hear stories of suffering and the changing shape of love, and the ways in which parents learning from their children is more deeply etched when parents believe their suffering has been valuable, when they see meaning and even redemption in their pain. The lessons often echo through the generations, offering parent perspectives and solace. Steve Saltzman remembers the unconditional love he felt from his maternal grandfather, whose kindness and generosity were so different from his mother, whose calculating and manipulative love always seemed to come at a hefty price. When Steve was a boy, his mother would give him 25 cents for every A on his report card, earning him a large bounty by semester's end, while his grandfather, in an act of radical love that said, I love you for you, would offer him 25 cents for any grade he received below an A. As Steve suffered through years of trying to love his own children, as he has come to terms with his daughter's lesbianism and volatile adolescence, and his son's mental illness, Steve has tried to hold fast to the precious inheritance from his grandfather, who loved him without limit or judgment. He believes that through the years of struggle, and with the gentle and insistent teachings of his offspring, he is getting closer to his grandfather's evolved and loving vision. It takes a long time to get there, he says wearily, but it is his last line, said in jest, which holds a fascinating truth. He muses, unconditional love comes immediately in the first week of life, and then it sort of disappears until much later, end quote. In between, there is suffering, the bedrock of love forced into more difficult forms. Thank you very much. I used what sociologists call, without humor, a snowball sample. In other words, you find someone who wants and is interested in talking about parenting and is interested in talking about what they're learning in parenting. It is not a secret agenda that I go out with. And you talk to them, and they are wise and interesting, and you say at the end of your conversation, do you have any other ideas of people I might talk to? And it goes along like that. So I found them everywhere, actually, in all walks of life. And although I would say that most folks were people that were relatively well educated and probably from middle and upper middle class backgrounds, many of them had grown up poor or working class. And a lot of what they were talking about had those kind of generational echoes that meant that those kind of feelings and attitudes and values were far more powerful than what might have appeared in their life now. None of the people that I spoke to had children who were heavily involved in hard drugs. Many of the people I spoke to had kids who, sustained themselves daily on drugs, but mostly marijuana, some on coke. So I only can imagine that what you're talking about in terms of developing a relationship both of intimacy and acceptance when you have to find a way of really distancing someone and saying no more. I can't protect you and I will not be hurt by you, and you have to move on. That those kinds of messages are huge exaggerations, I think, of what's going on. I did speak to people whose children had lots of criminal behavior, had been in jail a lot, had to go to sort of drug rehabilitation centers and things like that. So I saw some of this.
Did they ever mature into their real self?
At least the stories that I heard, it's still evolving. None of these stories had an end. There's no bow being tied at the end where you finally say, I'm done. It's just not what it is. One of the chapters, or one of the narratives in this book is exactly focused on that question. But I would not even need to speak to anyone else but myself about this. I am the mother of a fabulous son named Martin, who's 6'3" and handsome and gorgeous. And I've been living with this young man for the 33 years of his life. And ever since he was very little and walked out the door. He no longer lives with me, he hasn't lived with me since he was 18. But every time he walks out the door, I say, be careful out there. I always say that, and I have always said that. And it's what my parents said to my brother. And it's the kind of vulnerability my father's children felt for him. So this is not new. You have to recognize that this kind of fear has just come down across the generations. And as a child, I watched it in my father. I watched my parents trying to protect my brother, and now I'm trying to protect my son, knowing that at any moment he can get pulled over, as he was a number of times as an adolescent, thrown against a car, gun in his back. And I'm telling you, I saw that at the end of my street on Rutland Square in the South End, where the cop said he had made a wrong left turn onto the street and didn't believe that he lived there. So I don't know what to say, except that we, moms and dads, become very practiced in trying to figure, in finding a way to say to our sons, you are strong, you are beautiful, right? You are worthy, you are valued, right? And you deserve to be any place on this planet you want to be, and you deserve to get anywhere you want to go. On the other hand, you need to recognize that you are completely vulnerable to what might happen out there at any moment, you know. So you teach these kind of scripts. Yes, officer? I know, officer. I remember one time when my son was pulled over, and totally wrongly pulled over. He was traveling with a bunch of folks just along one of the highways like 95. He was in the middle of a line of traffic, so he wasn't going any faster than anyone else, but he was pulled over. Get over to the side. Had a buddy with him. Was probably around 21. And he said the cop made him get out of the car, and it was nasty to him. And my son Martin, he said, you did this and you did this. And my son Martin said, well, theoretically, I guess it would be. What do you mean theoretically? What are you, some kind of college graduate or something like that, throwing around language? Theoretically, you don't think I would know how to? I mean, it was just crazy. It was the biggest, most disrespectful, most dangerous put down you could possibly. And this was happening all the time as he was growing up. Now he has a kid, and he has a car that looks like a family car, and he has a beard, and he has spectacles, and he looks exactly like my dad, right? And he doesn't get pulled over quite as much, but it could happen anytime. So I really didn't need to interview anyone about this. I know it deeply, and you know, half the people I know in this world too experience this. You know, all of our kids recognize how much they teach us. I mean, this is not, you don't have to be Einstein or Freud or whoever those people are who are particularly insightful to know that. And I mean, she remembers these encounters, of course, very differently than I do, and different ones, and she thinks I'm exaggerating. But she also recognizes how precious her view of me is, and how much I'm honored by that view. So that it really, the feeling of your child knowing you as deeply as anyone could is just very lovely. And I think that her understanding of this project, her reading of the pages, has a lot to do with her feeling that I feel honored by the way she knows me. It's interesting because those of you who know me know that I'm still the child of a mother who is alive, and she's 102. And one of the things which has always been extraordinary about her is that she has always said to us, and I'm sure that this was one of the inspirations for the book, I've learned so much from you. And one of the things she thinks she's learned from me, I'm very different temperamentally than my mother. And I was always much, much more outspoken. I was the one who asked the impertinent question, right? and always raised up my voice, to be heard about something. And she was fascinated by that. And she would say, even as I was growing up, she would say to me, "I've never known anyone like you." And then that would follow by, "You teach me so much." And I think that she still feels that. And of course, it's easy to take when your parents teach you so much as well. In other words, when you feel a kind of a symmetry to that dynamic, then, they're not ripping you off and you're not ripping them off. You're both engaging in such a way that it's mutually reinforcing. And we can still say that she's the wisest person in the whole world at the same time as she is being taught by us. Yeah. So, yes, that was very much a part of our family curriculum.
Put a word in, even bird, not even a kind of bird. I would write that bird to be a lace bird, a paltry bird, a saffron sparkle word bird.